My father, every time he would visit us when they would come from South Carolina, wherever we lived, his first question would always be, "Does anybody in your church have a place to go fishing?" And I usually tried to scout before he got there to try to find some places he could go fishing. In fact, one of the last pictures I have of my dad in holding a bass that he caught at a pond of a church member in Texas where we were. And probably the last time he went fishing, last time that we have any picture of him catching something. That's a prized possession. But I remember one time in Kentucky, he came to visit us when we were pastoring there. And I said, "Dad, we got a stream over here that we can go fishing." Now, my dad was the best fisherman in our county in South Carolina. If you wanted to know anything about fishing, you would find out from my father where he was going, what he was doing, what he was using as bait. But you got to understand, he used a cane pole, monofilament line, a sinker, a hook, and a cork. And that was the extent of his tackle. And he caught more than anybody. But he was kind of old in his understanding of traditional in his understanding of fishing. So when I told him about this stream that was close to Bowling Green where we were, his first question to me was simply, "Do we have to put them back?" Now, for my father, that was a cardinal sin to catch a fish and put the fish back. Like that was going against nature if you did something like that. So this idea of whether we can keep them or we have to release them was something that was important to him. And releasing is something that a fish never has any question about. A fish is always for the release option rather than the keep option. For a fish, that's always a good thing. But is it as obvious that being released is good for those that we love sometimes? That sometimes instead of hanging on, releasing the people we love might be the best thing for them. Have you ever been in a situation that someone demanded freedom and you knew it was not going to be handled right by them, but you knew for their eventual good, you had to let them go? Have you ever been in a situation that you constantly tried to protect someone, but realized for their eventual good, you were going to have to let them go, even though you knew when you let them go, they would fall and fail? How can the remedy for the one you love so much and have worried about and given so much of yourself, how can the remedy be to release that loved one? Well, we're looking over the next 9 weeks at this parable in Scripture they call the Prodigal Son. There's a really good book that's been written called Prodigal God, which follows the same story, which is a great supplement to this sermon series if you'd like to have something to read. Also, there's a book by Henry Nouwen that's a really good book to go along with the prodigal concept as we're looking at it. But we're going to break it down, look at different parts of it, turn it in different ways, and understand it hopefully in a different way than we've ever understood this idea of the lost son. So we're looking today at Luke 15, verses 11 and 12. Luke 15, verses 11 and 12, and we're talking about God granting our desires so that our needs might be discovered. That God grants our desires sometimes just simply so that we can understand and discover the absolute needs that we have. There are 3 things I want to say to you: that releasing someone can be the best thing for them if a few things are in place. One is there's a loving relationship. Secondly, there's an encouraging environment. And third, there's an ultimate perspective that you are using as you do that. In a loving relationship, we see verse 11, Jesus continued, there was a man who had 2 sons. And in verse 12, the younger one said to the father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided his property between them. That's what we're looking at today, just those 2 verses of this parable. There are times that we ask God for things that he says no. because the best way he can love us is to deny what we're asking for, because that is not a good choice for us. But there are times that we ask God for something, and even though it isn't the best choice for us, it could be that he allows it so that we can understand something deeper and more meaningful that we will never understand any other way. So that's the backdrop of what we're talking about today. So let's look at the passages. Jesus continued. Now, he had just talked about the lost coin and the lost sheep. Now he's talking about the lost son. So he's continuing with another parable now. A parable, of course, we talked about last week, is a fictional story told to teach a factual lesson. Jesus continued, there was a man who had. That word had is an interesting word when I look at it. This word had speaks of relationship, speaks of not ownership, but a sense of possession at a point that these were his two sons. And he was one who had a deep relationship with them, who cared about them, who wanted the best for them, who wanted to see them succeed in life. There was a relationship there. And it mentions not just the one son, we're going to look at it first and introduce the second one later, but he talks from the very beginning about his two sons. There was a man who had two sons. Now, some people say the reason that the second son is mentioned this earlier is because throughout the teaching of Jesus, he always has a comparison between two people. There's the tax collectors and sinners on one side. There's the Pharisees and the teachers on another side. They're the people that the culture and society would see as bad, but Jesus looked at their heart and saw them as good. And then there were those that the societal systems would see as influential and good, but yet God looked on their heart and saw the bad. So in talking about the two sons, carrying forth the same thing of the contrast between tax collectors and sinners and the Pharisees and the teachers. And then it talks about having two sons. Sons, it speaks of kinship. It speaks of family. It speaks of two that had the same father. There's a deep, loving relationship here. Years ago, I heard this story, and you've heard it possibly, of a man who was climbing a mountain in Utah. It was a high mountain, a tall mountain that was mainly rock. He was by himself. And as he drives one stake into the side of the mountain, he grabs hold of that stake. At the same time, the ropes give way, and everything that was securing him is no longer there. And he's dangling from the side of that rock-faced mountain with one hand from that stake. And he finally looks around and he sees nobody. So he yells out, "Is there anyone here? Is there anyone here?" Finally, a voice comes from the top and says, "Yes." "Who is it?" "God." "What can I do, God?" "Will you do what I tell you to do?" "Yes, I will." "What do you want me to do?" "Help me, God." "Let go." "Is there anyone else up there?" You know, you've heard the story. You know, that's an old preacher story. But it talks about that sense to where sometimes God just wants us to let go and fall into his hands. Let go and fall into his security. Let go and let him be the one who helps us do those things and corrects us and gives us the sense of being where we need to be. Letting go to fall only, though, makes sense because it is our Heavenly Father who's commanded it. He is able, he is connected, and he is in a loving relationship with us. You see, releasing the one we love is a redeemable action only if it occurs within the culture of a loving relationship. Some people release their children to get rid of them. "I'm tired of it. I'm cutting you out of my will. I don't love you anymore. Get out. I never want to see you again." That's not what he's doing. He is releasing his son, but he's releasing his son with love. He never at any point tells a son that he's cut off. He never at any point says, "You are not to come back." He never at any point says, "You are no longer my son. I don't know your name. I've cut you out. You're gone." But he does release him. He does release him. There is this personal, loving relationship. Look at this painting. This is Rembrandt's painting of Thomas, who has doubted if this one is Jesus. And he wants some physical proof. He wants to know that this is Jesus. He wants to feel the nail marks, feel the spear thrust, know that this is Christ, feel the wounds. There is a sense of a strong relationship. And Thomas, even though he should have believed by faith, he needed something that was even more than that. And Jesus did not reject him for that. Jesus allowed him to feel that, to understand that, because Jesus had a loving relationship even with people who doubted him, even with people who would turn against him. He never moved people outside of a loving relationship. No matter what you have done in life, no matter what action you've ever taken in life, you've never moved out of a loving relationship that God has with you. God loves you regardless of what we've done. And I've done some boneheaded things in my life. God still loves us. We cannot escape his love. In fact, I had a seminary professor tell me that he feels like the greatest understanding of hell one day is that we have an unrequited love, that we love, that God loves us and we cannot respond to God. And that is agony for us because he loves us and we cannot respond. That unrequited love is what is the agony of afterlife without him, that separation from him. He loves us regardless. But not only can God grant desires so that our needs can be understood or discovered, need to happen in a loving relationship. It needs to happen in an encouraging environment. The first part of verse 12. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." Give me my share of the estate. You really need to look at these words and understand the context and sense the energy and sense the spirit that he has in this point. First of all, we're told he is the younger son, less prominence. When his father dies, he's to get 1/3 of the estate. The other son, who's the older, is to get 2/3 of the estate. He has less problem. Maybe that had something to do with his anguish in this situation. Maybe this was why he wanted his own thing. Maybe he was frustrated because he was the youngest. I don't know. But he was the youngest. And he said, now this word said means to command, a demand. It's not just, hey, by the way, Dad, I was thinking, can I have my money? It was someone who had thought about it, who wanted to go in with strength, and he wanted to demand what he felt like he was entitled. And he went into his father, the authority figure, the powerful one, and he says, give me. He demands his father, give me. That means to bring it forth, to deliver it up. It's very direct and to the point. The message in that paraphrase says, I want it right now, is really what the spirit of that is. And then when he says my share, that's talking about the portion that he feels like belongs to him, the division that he feels like is already his. In the message, it says, what's coming to me? The message says, he says, I want right now what's coming to me. Have you ever been approached by someone you love that for whatever reason, they come to us with that kind of anger, come with us with that kind of self-centeredness, come to us with demanding something they have no right to demand? How do we respond? How do we deal with that? What's interesting to me that even in the midst of all this, the father does not react. He does not overreact. He doesn't take it out on the son. There is an encouragement that surrounds this family. I would think that this father had dealt with this son for some time, that he had seen failure after failure after failure, that he had prayed for his son and wanted more for his son and wanted the best for his son. And when the son demanded what he demanded, I'm sure that the father knew what would happen if he gave the inheritance to the son. But maybe he had come to the last the last resort that he had. Maybe he had no other ideas. Maybe they had no other option. But in an encouraging environment, he's thinking, well, maybe I can do this, even though it shouldn't be done, even though no one does this. Maybe I should do this. Maybe this will be just what is taking place. See, encouragement is not always helping someone through the good things. Sometimes encouragement is helping someone through the difficult things, and that's a way to encourage them. Kenneth Bailey researched this ungrateful demand for years, and he wrote this. He said, I've looked at this for over 15 years. During those 15 years, I have been asking people from all walks of life, from Morocco to India, from Turkey to the Sudan, about the implications of a son's request for his inheritance while the father is still living. The answer has always been emphatically the same. The conversation runs as follows. Has anyone in your village ever made a request like this? Never. Could anyone make such a request? Impossible. If anyone did, what would happen? His father would beat him, of course. Why? Listen to this. The request means he wants his father to die. He wants something that only comes at the death of his father. He wants to treat his father as if he is dead. He wants what he thinks comes to him, and it is as if he is planning on his father never in his eyes ever being alive again. That's what he is doing in that case. And yet, the father allowed the demand. Even in that case, the father allowed the demand. You see, in an environment where love is unconditional and is not removed over a rebellious action or an unwise decision, provides the fertile ground for a remedy. If love is conditional and I only love you if you do the things I want you to do, it's never going to work. If you say you do this and you're forever gone and I'm washing my hands of you, it will never work. If it's only about the short run and not the long term, this will never work. It's got to be in a loving relationship with an encouraging environment that this can become the grounds of a remedy for that relationship. Look at the mother and the children at the table. That to me is an encouraging setting. Now, when I look at this, having a couple grandchildren, it kind of pops out to me a little better now. You got one child that's obedient. She's sitting up in the chair she's supposed to because she can eat from there. I wonder what went through the conversation of the little girl that decides she wants to sit in that chair. It couldn't have had anything to do with eating from the table, could it? She could barely reach the table. I wonder if maybe there was a statement that, she wanted her chair. I don't know. But if you see the mother looking at her, there is a sense of encouragement that's taking place. She's allowing her to sit there, as she has asked her probably to sit in another chair like her sister is. But she is looking at her with an encouraging glance from what it looks like to me. It looks like to me to be an environment there of allowing a person to make some decisions and an encouraging experience in the midst of all of that. You see, the third thing, though, not only a loving relationship, not only an encouraging environment, but we must have an ultimate perspective on things to really be able to see things the way we need to. Notice what it says in the last part of verse 12. So he divided his property between them. So he divided his property between them. That word so tells me there's a pause there. I sense that the father knew what he was getting ready to do, and he knew what the immediate response would be. And of course, we'll be studying that in days ahead. But the immediate response would certainly be probably the young son crumbling into a situation of sin and probably poverty. And the father probably knew that, so he had to pause. He's considering it, but he goes ahead and does it. He separated his property. He gave 1/3 to the son who demanded it. The other son got 2/3, but it doesn't say that he left with it. He stayed. But I'm sure that he had to offer it to his second son at that moment because he was acting as if he was not alive by doing this. You got to understand what an inheritance was in that day. It was the representation of a person's entire life. It was a statement of who he was. It was a statement of his desires and his hopes and dreams for his children. It was his livelihood. This son came and demanded 1/3 of this man's livelihood. And yet he let him have it. Why? I think because the father had a perspective that went past the immediate. The father had a way of looking down and seeing the future in his mind, that he knew that what he was doing now was not working, and hopefully this could be something good for his son. So he divided his property between them. I don't know how many of you saw the 2010 film 127 Hours starring James Franco, but it tells another story of a man who was climbing a mountain. In an actual mountain climbing experience, Aaron Ralston, who's an experienced climber, had an 800-pound boulder trap his right hand against the wall of a rock on a peak. This was in a remote Utah canyon, and he was by himself. After 5 days, Aaron realized that to live, he would have to amputate his own hand using a cheap multi-use tool. Doesn't sound like something you do at Emory, right? But that was his choice. Either he was going to die or he was going to have to deal with a lot of pain. Either he was going to die or he was going to have to deal with something that was not immediately very pleasing to deal with. But he decided, if I'm going to live, I've got to deal with the pain. So he amputates his hand by himself in that mountain with a cheap tool. Doesn't even say it was a knife. A cheap multi-use tool so that he could live. And he's alive today. Sometimes pain is necessary to achieve life. Sometimes we have to go through pain, whether it's our actual pain to learn a lesson or it's our own pain for our children to learn a lesson, and we have as much pain as as they do. My dad used to say, this whipping hurts me more than it does you. I used to think, well, why does he keep doing it? Because it hurts that bad, But there is pain when we see our children struggling, when we see our children dealing with the worst. We have pain about that too. Are we willing to deal with the pain to get to the other side, to see if life can be had? You see, perspective enables actions that can provide the opportunity for a life correction in the ones we release. In Texas, where we were for 16 years in the Austin area, we had a man in our church that was struggling terribly with his sons. One son tried to commit suicide. The other son was going on in his own direction. And he had some friends, and he called us together, about 4 of us one day. And he said, guys, you need to pray for me, pray for my sons, pray that somehow or another we can find our way through this. And there was a statement made by one of the other men in that meeting that I've always remembered, that I've always held close to my heart. And he said this. He said, the book of your son has not been finished yet. You don't throw up your hands and give up in the middle of the book. You go to the end of the book so you can see what God does in a person's life. This young man eventually got a law degree. He's the district attorney in the county there now. Believe me, in high school, that would not have been what people thought he was heading toward. It happens. It happens. But this person was saying to my friend, you need to look in the long term, not just the short term. You need to have perspective to not give up at the moment, because God is not finished with your son yet. And sometimes your son has to get to the place that he hears God before God can do what he wants to do in your son's life. The struggles that Linda and I have had as we've been raising children, I've always remembered that. And it's come around to be true for us too. You don't give up in the middle of the story. You let the story come to its development. If you look at the picture now, you'll see that Abraham probably went through a time of real despair, thinking about what God had commanded him to do. God had commanded him to kill his only son. God had already told him he was going to be the father of a mighty nation. This was his only son by his wife. That doesn't make sense. That doesn't, certainly if God makes sense, he wouldn't have me do this. But he followed God. He obeyed God. And the writer of Hebrews tells us he knew that God could raise him up anyhow if God wanted him to. So he had faith in God. He did what God wanted to do. So he's ready to sacrifice his son. Of course, we know the story. Right about the time he's getting ready to do it, an angel comes down, stops, provides a ram in the bushes to be the sacrifice. Of course, we understand that as a symbolic understanding of Jesus who comes and dies for us so we don't have to die ourselves. But that was the story. I'm sure Abraham was faced with the fact that did he do what he was told to do? In the short term, it didn't make sense, but I'm sure he had a longer view at it. He had a perspective that made him understand God in other dimensions than just the immediate dimension that he was looking at. So when we look at the two verses of the story today, there's an immediate lesson and then there's an ultimate lesson. The immediate lesson is this: letting go of the ones we love and watching them fall is one of the toughest things we will ever do, but it could be the first step toward their spiritual maturity and wholeness in a loving relationship with an encouraging environment with perspective. The ultimate lesson, though, is this: we have told God we want ours. We have rebelled. We have gone our own way. We think life is all about us. We wanted it our way, and we have left him. Henry Nouwen writes that this leaving is a denial of the spiritual reality that I belong to God with every part of my being, that God holds me safe in an eternal embrace. In fact, the Apostle Peter says, "For you were like sheep gone astray." We have left the fold. We have rebelled against God. We have sinned. That has separated us from God. And we have to decide whether we want to come home or not. You need to understand that the Father is there waiting. The Father is there wanting you. The Father is there desiring for you to come home. He wants you to come home. He desires for us to come home, but we have to decide whether we're going to come or not. We eventually sense our lostness, which is the first step toward transformation. Are we willing? Do we want? Will we come home? You see, the whole gospel is about this idea that God desires the best for us, and us in our rebellion sinned against him, and it separated us from him. And we will die separated from him if we don't come home. He wants us to come home. He wants us, no matter what has happened, no matter what has taken place, no matter what has developed in life, he wants us to come home. He has never not loved us. He loves us always. He cares about us. He wants to encourage us. He wants to develop us. He wants the last of our story to be a tremendous celebration. But we have to decide whether we want to come home, whether we want to come home. In the Dance of Hope, Bill Frey tells of a blind student named John who he tutored in college. He asked John one day how it happened. An accident in teen years took his sight, and he said, not only took my sight, but it took my hope. I lost my hope when I lost my eyesight. He said, I was bitter and I was angry at God. I took it out on everyone around me. Pity caused me to be unwilling to do anything. I wanted everybody to serve me, to help me. He said, one day my father was tired of the pity party and wanted me to have a life and demanded that I mount these storm windows he had for me to do by that afternoon by myself. I was angry. I'll show them. I'll fall and hurt myself. They'll feel sorry for me then. But little by little, he got it done, and he began to have a different view about his life. He said this, I later discovered that at no time during that day had my father ever been more than 4 or 5 feet from my side. He didn't know it at the time, but the Father had never left him, had never abandoned him. Thus, the difference in our story. Our Heavenly Father has let us go. We have fallen, but instead of waiting idly at home for us to return one day, He is near. He is encouraging us. He is just in our presence, only a whisper away, a repentant heart away. See the prodigal in the picture? This part of the story, what I pick from Rembrandt's painting here is the face of the Father. Of course, we'll study about the son coming home in a later passage. But in this passage, what I see is there was never a time that hope disappeared. There was a sense of hope for this son that was always etched on the Father, who, of course, in the parable represents God in our understanding of the story. Would you pray with me, please?